Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to share with you some thoughts on explanation, and particularly explanation that matters. And I want to introduce some ideas about meta-provenance. So I will describe first, what do I mean by explanations that matter? I'll talk about how we can use provenance to explain the analysis process. And I want to focus and concentrate on meta-provenance. How do we explain the rationale and context for our models and our analysis? And I'll give you some key concepts in meta-provenance. And I'll talk at the end about future directions and nice areas of research in this respect. So let's talk about what matters in explanations. So I work a lot on AI in scientific domains, and this is an example of one of our projects. We study the environment, we study how humans interact with the environment, all kinds of issues about flooding and droughts affecting agriculture, food availability, food insecurity, how we can maintain a sustainable water cycle. So in all of these problems, there's a need to use models from different domains that have different understanding of aspects of the problem. And the models are very sophisticated. In this case, hydrology models contain a lot of knowledge about physics, agriculture models contain a lot of models about biology. In some cases, they'll use machine learning to either calibrate the parameters of these models, and sometimes machine learning models are used as well. And in all of these circumstances, we're trying to understand what is happening in this system, and that can lead to decisions. And the work that we do is that we care very much about what models we are using. We care about having the users understand why we use those models, what is it that those models represent, what are their limitations, and how that affects how they make decisions. So we've put a lot of work on representing how the models deal with data, what kinds of physical variables they represent. Different models represent different variables, what kind of constraints the models have, how can you adjust parameters to look at different scenarios. From the point of view of the users, they care about what if scenarios, what if this happened? They care about what are the options, what are the different predictions that we can make, what models are available, what data does each model take into account, what limitations they have, and what are the potential interventions. This is the most important part. What can I do to ameliorate the situation? And so in this kind of context, it gives us a lot of ways to think about what do we need to explain so that users understand and trust the models that we are creating. So in terms of explanations that matter, our users want to know, are we using the best data available? And so the choice of data sources matters, and we have to convey that. Why should I believe in this model? How did you choose this model? What are its scope and assumptions? How did you choose the training data? How did you validate it? Did you estimate uncertainty? So all of these aspects are very important. Also, are the what if scenarios that seem to be in the horizon, are they plausible or likely or not? And how can I affect outcomes through interventions? So in all of this, you notice that it's crucial to represent the rationale and the choices, not so much the model internals, but more about how the model can expose its strengths, its limitations, and how it is the best possible model that we could have built. So explanations lead to understanding and trust. And I want to break down a little bit how the explanations connect through different pieces of knowledge. So when we do an analysis, it has many steps. We call that a workflow. There's data preparation steps. There's all sorts of preparations that we do before we run models. The models are kind of one of the results and the products of the analysis. They have an entity on their own. They can run many times to produce a variety of results. The results then are combined with what we know about the domain, and then that generates findings. What's interesting is that the users can be asking about explanations of the analysis and the analysis process. Was it done properly? Can I trust it? Why was it done that way? Why not some other way? Is this the best possible? In terms of the models, they also have a lot of questions about the assumptions and the limitations. And finally, they want to understand the results and what's new about these results and how confident we are about them, or kinds of what if scenarios and varying things slightly just to help us understand the outcomes of this analysis. So these are different kinds of explanations and questions that we can ask. I will say that if you look at explanations generated by hand and generating by people, it's kind of interesting. So I'll give you an example from scientific papers. So this is work that we did some years ago. We took a paper that was published in the literature and we read through it and tried to understand what is the analysis method and what is the high-level workflow that was followed. And so you can see the workflow on the right. And from one of the paragraphs, we got the idea that they were executing this software called SMAP to compare ligand binding sites. And so it was very clear that that's what it was being done in that step. When we actually tried to implement the method and make it work and operational, it turns out that there were many subtleties to this. The software was run twice with inputs from two different sources. There was a prioritization and a sorting and a filtering and then a merging of those results. And so what appeared to be one step in the paper actually involved quite a bit of sophisticated analysis. And there were reasons to do it that way. So what we have found through studies like this and through studies from others is that even scientific papers that are supposed to be rigorous, and we all aim to make them as accurate as possible, even scientific papers omit necessary steps, they may skip important details, and sometimes are inaccurate. And when you reconstruct the work, sometimes authors will say, oh yeah, I think we did this because of that, and so on. And so it's just not described quite right. So it's to the point where Baggerly and Coombs doing this kind of reproduction from the cancer literature, they refer to it as forensic research. So you're basically trying to deconstruct what was done, and it is research in its own right because you have to fill in so many missing gaps and do so many corrections. So the way that we as humans write reports is perhaps not ideal. So part of this study, we looked at what would it take to read this text and really understand what was done. And what we found through these colorful reproducibility maps that you see on the right is that if you are an author, you would know how to do it. If you're not, it would be really, really challenging. So the question is, can we generate automatically the narrative of the analysis? So if we have the analysis done computationally, which is how we do analysis, can we have machines generate reports? These reports will be accurate, they'll be complete, they will be customizable. So if I'm interested in, excuse me, if I'm interested in certain aspects, that's what I will be able to see. I can ask what if questions perhaps and have the machine run the report again or run the analysis again. The analysis can be updated. So maybe my papers would be up to date, or if I have new data from my customers, then my analysis and my report will be up to date. And I would be able to compare two different approaches or two different analyses more easily because we have all of those structures. So what would it take? It turns out, I don't think this is an impossible task. And it would just require a lot of subtlety about the machine's understanding what was done. So what would it take to generate these reports? One key idea that I want to introduce is provenance. So provenance is key for explanations and it's key for trust. Provenance refers to the record that you have when you run a process, when you executed a process, and you understand the process, the entities, and anything else that was involved in producing, delivering, or influencing a product or a result. So a process is something like the method to create champagne. There's a specific method. And if you don't follow that method, then you don't have the right provenance for your product. You cannot be certified as champagne. Not to mention the location as well. The resources, so does my data come from this collider or from what other instrument? It's very important to describe what resources you started with and what resources you use to do your process. And then finally, the entities. Was this done by someone who had credentials in this area? Was it done by a company that one trusts, and so on and so forth? So these are the pillars of provenance, and that is something that we have to integrate into data analysis so that we can actually explain what happened. So throughout the talk, I will introduce this notion of provenance to describe the analysis process. And then I'll talk about MetaProvenance to introduce how to justify the rationale and the context for that analysis process. So let's start with provenance. I'll use a simple example. So these are topic models. And what you see on the left is a very simple process and a very simple workflow. We just remove stop words, we remove small words. We have to reformat the data set to whatever the model requires to train the topics, and then out comes some result. So we could take that workflow, that process that we had on the left, and run it and generate narratives from that provenance. So here's some examples. On the top, I focus on how the topic training was run on a certain input data, but I actually include details about the parameter settings and so on. In the second one, I talk about the software and the version because perhaps that is important for some purposes. At the bottom, I just talk about and highlight the input data that was used and what if that was changed to another input data. And so you can look at this analysis from different perspectives, and I think that they all contribute something different to understanding it. And for different audiences, you may need different aspects of it, but that process and that provenance is key. So here's some possible narratives. Maybe I vary the steps that I report. So at the top, I'm just saying the main step is the topic training. For someone that really wants to see exactly all the steps that were done, I have to mention pre-processing, I have to mention reformatting, and that's that explanation at the bottom. I can also vary the execution details. So as I mentioned before, you can say, here were the inputs, here were my outputs, or you can go into more details about all the parameter values that were used and so on. So there's many ways to report this, and we actually prototyped a system called Dana for data narratives that gives you different views on in recounting what a workflow and what a provenance trace produce. So these are some examples, but you can look at it from an execution perspective, from a data perspective. I already gave you the examples. You can describe dependencies between the steps. Some of these steps may be interrelated and reuse outputs from others. You can discuss the implementation details. You can discuss the software in a lot of details, and you can imagine that different people will be interested in different kinds. Here's a view of Dana linking the provenance trace on the right to the explanations on the left. And so you can manipulate one or the other and see and even change the workflow and the runs to different ones by manipulating the explanation. So you could try different inputs and so on. So in all of this description that I've given you of provenance, I want to also tease out that we actually have the workflow and the provenance as separate entities. So the workflow is a general method, the provenance is the execution, and they're all interlinked, and we've developed representations to support this. So for provenance, we use the W3C Prov standard, and it has these three pillars of provenance: the agents, the entities, the activities. I think I call them processes, resources, and entities before, but they are these three pillars of provenance. Prov is a descendant of the open provenance model that several of us developed for scientific applications, and is now widely used commercially and everywhere. So it's a very key ingredient of our technologies so that we build tools that are general. We take this provenance records, the provenance, the workflows, and publish them as linked data on the web. So this enables us to mine these records. We can find commonly used subsets of steps and patterns. That can give us trust on certain workflows if they were used very often and were used for many data analysis by many different people. So we've done some studies with neuroscience workflows in this way. These are all ontologies for plans, for workflows, for provenance that we have published and are available to you. So the takeaways is that if you want to explain the analysis process, provenance is a key concept. Use tools that record your workflow, that record the runs of those workflows as provenance, that record the metadata that you're using. Prefer tools that use standards like W3C, Prov, and seek tools that generate explanations from these machine readable records that give you visualizations or narratives, in our case, for explaining those analytic records. So far I told you about provenance and capturing the analysis, but that's one tiny piece of all of the kinds of explanations that I mentioned before the users want to see. So they want to see the rationale of the analysis. Is it the best possible approach that you could have taken? Is this the best model? What are the assumptions? There's all sorts of other questions. So I want to move on and tell you about MetaProvenance and the power that that can bring to us in terms of explaining analysis and explaining results. There's 4 key aspects that I want to discuss for MetaProvenance. How did that analysis came about? So that's questions, templates, sources, and modeling choices. I'm going to start with the questions. So in the example that I gave before, this project where we're looking at the water cycle and its interaction with food security, flooding, sustainability, we always start with questions. The questions really drive the choice of models, the choice of data, the need for the accuracy of the model. So we always start with questions. And depending on the questions, we'll have to choose combinations of models. We'll have to choose data, input data of certain resolution, certain accuracy, and so on. So it matters a lot what kind of questions somebody's asking. Some questions require very, very detailed models that take a lot of work to build. But if the question is a simple one, then we can answer with very simple models that are very quick to run. So understanding the questions is really crucial. And so we're starting to categorize and map out the types of questions that we can be asked. This is an example from another domain, multiomics, where we are building a system that automatically analyzes the data based on the question. So the question comes in the form, in this case, of a hypothesis, whether a protein is expressed in a patient sample. And so we are capturing the approach that the humans take. So they'll decide what kind of data they would like to see, and based on the data that comes back, what kind of analysis they run, and then how do they interpret the findings. And so capturing this really is driven by the type of question that is being asked. So we have published a hypothesis ontology. We're expanding this to questions. We're looking at questions in different domains, but this is very much a very active area of research for us, and I think very important to capture and characterize the types of questions and how they map to types of analysis. So that was the first aspect of MetaProvenance. A second key aspect is the idea of templates and analytic templates. So this is part of a project called AutoTS to automate time series analysis. We've done work on AutoML, automating machine learning before, but this one's focused on time series analysis. And what we're doing is capturing analytic strategies that are proven to work, that are high quality, that experts would follow very carefully, and capturing them as abstract templates. So on the top of the diagram, you see all the major steps that we follow for spectral analysis. And for each of the steps, there may be one way to do it, or there may be several approaches to it. So when transforming to the frequency domain, there's a range of algorithms that one can follow to do it. And each of them has different requirements. So for example, it may be important that there's no missing values, but in other cases, it doesn't matter. And so this is an example of this high-level template that you have to follow and consider all of your options and be able to generate a correct and valid analysis. So we've looked at all these abstractions with the steps, and we've been able to identify that it's important to look at general steps and how they can be specialized with different algorithms, but it's also important to look at entire subsets of steps that may be collapsed into some short description, so that would be a sub-workflow. We've also looked at criticality, so in some cases the steps are not important. For example, reformatting a data set is not very important, and you should be able to figure out that there needs to be a data transformation or a reformatting there. There's also data abstractions in the way that we describe how different steps pass on data and of what type. And so based on all these types of abstractions, it should be possible to describe these high-level templates. And one example here is the step abstraction. So we actually build taxonomies of the types of steps. These are examples from multiomics. And so we build taxonomies of the types of steps, the sub-steps, the algorithms, and then finally the implementations. And the implementations may be very, very different in different languages or different approaches and so on. We actually reason about these taxonomies of methods from abstract to specific implementation. So our workflow system is called Wings, and we can actually represent each constituent of the workflow. So whether it's a step or an input data set or some intermediate result, we give them an identifier. They can have metadata, so we can express their properties. We organize them into these templates, as I showed you all the steps. And then finally, we add constraints that can be attached to the steps or to the data sets or to the workflow itself. And so through those constraints, we have workflow reasoning algorithms that, given a data set, will specialize this high-level template. In each step will be executable. It will set parameters if they're missing through these constraints, and it will generate metadata for the outputs also through these constraints. So this is very exciting because now we can use these workflow templates very effectively and automate this process. So the idea is that you start with a high-level workflow template. We call them skeletal plans. In AI, skeletal planning is a very, very early approach to planning. So it's a skeleton, but as we reason and as we add constraints, we fill out the details of the workflow, as you'd see in this diagram. So just to give a little bit more detail, every data set has metadata. Most of the metadata is automatically extracted. So the minute you upload a data set and as you're running the workflow, there's basically what would be the equivalent of sensors looking at what the data set looks like and what properties it has. And then those metadata are used to express constraints. So in this case, it's a constraint that says that the MTM method requires evenly spaced data. And so you need to make provisions upstream in the workflow to make that happen. So that general analysis strategy on the left turns into these workflow templates, and then we have these abstractions, taxonomies of components and steps that help us specialize that template. So just to give an example, we start with a general template for spectrum analysis. And if we select the multi-taper method, then that requires evenly spaced data. So that step is included in the workflow. But on the right, I don't know if you see that it is shaded. And so that step is not run because the WWZ transform does not require that the data is evenly spaced. And so that way, with this general template, we can produce different analysis, and we know why the analysis looks a certain way. So you can see now that the narratives, we are able to describe different levels of detail. So you can say we're using spectral analysis, or we're using WWZ method, or we're using the implementation from the Pilot Clim software package. So you can be very specific or very general about the way that you describe these steps. And finally, you can compare different analysis. So you can say, I did these 3 analyses and I got these different results, or you can say, you know, this was the only kind of method that was possible given the characteristics of the data. So this allows you to look at the choices of methods and the possibilities that you considered in the analysis. In addition to the explanations that I give you as examples, there's also quite a bit of advantages to this. So this is work that Pedro Zekeli and others in my institutes have done on using templates and abstractions for automating machine learning. So they encode templates. They have more than 30 templates that include best practices for tables, time series, classification, all kinds of data types and algorithms, and they are actually able to generate thousands of pipelines that beat the human baseline for any of the problems given. So you can see here for hundreds of problems, almost 300 problems, they actually generated a lot of analysis that beat the human baseline. So the idea of templates and abstractions is very, very powerful indeed. So that's about template. I want to talk about another key aspect of MetaProvenance very quickly, but it's very important, which is sources. So explaining the sources improves trust. And I think that's undeniable. Rarely do you have a system that is built with all in-house components. Often you rely on open source software, you rely on open available data. So it's very important to explain where the sources came from. And so we've done a lot of work, and I show you here an example of documenting the provenance of the sources and all of the details of how something becomes a constituent in our workflows. So we know the authors, the software, the version, the papers that were written about it, and most importantly, we know how many workflows have used this software. So OntoSoft is a software repository with metadata. It doesn't contain the code. It points to GitHub or other repositories, but it will describe important aspects of the software, and then we can account for it as people use more and more workflows, and how popular is this software versus others. That's a very, very frequent question. What else are other people using? And I'm sure that in this audience, many will identify with that. Another crucial aspect of attribution is that as your data is updated and as the methods are improved, we have to upgrade our analysis. And so being able to say, yeah, that was the result 2 months ago when we didn't have this method, or that was a result 2 months ago when we didn't have this data, and really be able to justify that you couldn't do better 2 months ago, that there were these technologies and this data were not available to you. And so being able to link all of these prior results and all of these updates is very important. And this is part of also the frameworks and the representations that we support. Finally, I want to mention a fourth key aspect of MetaProvenance that I think is very important, and I think a very active area of research for us, and we should all push forward, which is the modeling choices. Why was this model chosen, and what does it mean for the results and for the analysis? So one of the things that we do is capture as much as possible the model assumptions. So we work a lot with models in hydrology, and we're capturing the conditions under the model was calibrated. And so we use drought conditions. Another model was done with average conditions. And so the model now is trained to work best for those ranges of conditions. Also, we capture how the model is addressing certain aspects of the situation or the context. So in some cases, the model has some recharge averages. So some of the inputs have average values, but in other cases, we'll let you provide that recharge information, those kinds of inputs. And so we may let you customize the model further or not customize it and use average values. And so all of these built-in assumptions we expose, we describe, and we make very explicit so that it's clear under what circumstances to use every kind of model. The other aspect that we look at is how the models link to interventions and ultimately decisions, right? So you know, if we study potential interventions, and somebody can make decisions about those. But what we're trying to do is tease out from any model. You see in the middle of the slide this diagram of the model variables and processes. And at the bottom, all of the model parameters that are used, you know, the soils, the solar radiation, and so on. Ultimately, the users of these models outside of science do not really care to know very much about this. What they care about is what you see on the left and the right of the slide. They care about drivers to the model and the modeling scenario. So if the weather goes drier, then what happens? They care about intervention. So if we plant different crops that grow faster, then will I avoid the flooding in the spring? Or if I use more fertilizer, will that produce too many weeds? And would I have to hire more people to do the weeding? Or if I plant earlier, would I avoid the flood? So these are all potential things that one can control. And then, of course, it's very important, what are the outputs of the model that really matter to making these decisions, because ultimately you want to increase maximize the crop yield. And so that's how we view models. There's internals to them, and then there's the connections to how the users view the models. And so we have very rich representations of models that include the formats of the data, the variables that they include, the constraints, but most importantly, the adjustable parameters, things that a user can change to study different potential interventions and scenarios. And so our explanations actually have quite a bit of context. We can say, these are the indicators and the indices that the model generates. This is output that you can use to measure something of interest. This is the kind of configuration or calibration that was used, and then we could go into details about how that work done. And we don't do that yet, but that's a very important piece to include, especially you know, where the data, what data was used to do this kind of model training and parameter calibration. We also show the parameters that were adjusted for the scenarios, and finally the interventions that were analyzed. So from a computational perspective, these are all inputs, outputs, and data, internal, intermediate, final. But for users, this is how they think about the problems. No matter what the models look like, no matter what domain, these are the main things that matter. And so this is kind of meta provenance of how that model was used and how it was designed to answer certain questions that I showed you earlier. So the questions are very tied to how we present the adjustable parameters, the scenarios, the interventions, etc. So we've published a software description ontology to describe models. It's very focused on these models that are used for natural processes, human processes. I think there's a lot to do in terms of describing properly machine learning models and more you know, different kinds of models that are used today. So these are the key takeaways of MetaProvenance. I've told you about the questions, very important to drive the process, very important to make explicit to a user the questions, determine the drivers of how you choose models, how you choose and adjust parameters, etc. Templates as a key idea to ensure that your method is really following proven approaches and well-seasoned steps that the expert would follow, and they're followed properly. Sources so that you can reassure that you're using the best possible methods, that people have looked at the analysis, who has reviewed things. And then finally, the modeling choices by really describing how the method is addressing the questions and enabling the users to answer those questions and explore scenarios. So we've talked about provenance, meta-provenance. I want to close with some future directions. So we started out talking about explanations, spent time talking about provenance and how that helps explain the analysis and what was done. But we're starting to move into meta-provenance issues where we can explain the rationale. Why was the analysis done a certain way? Why was a model chosen? How is the model relating to decisions or analysis or interventions that the user cares about? The assumptions and the limitations of the models. There's a lot more to do in terms of explanation of results. So how do we compare the results with our current knowledge or our current understanding of our customers or the scientific domain or nature, and really see what are truly the new findings in this context. So there's a lot of really interesting work being done in this space as well that I haven't talked about. But all of these questions to me are really important to explain to users. So we talked about provenance, meta-provenance. I think the reports are accurate, truth to what actually was done, customizable. I showed you many examples of that. We can explore what ifs easily. We can update the results very easily, and we can compare different analyses and contrast. So kind of as a summary, these are all the ideas that we discussed. In terms of provenance, we talked about execution versus method, the workflow itself versus the execution. In meta-provenance, we talked about using questions, templates that are proven to work, documenting sources, and really documenting modeling choices. I think critical areas of future work include explaining the limitations and the assumptions of models. So what can we say about the range of scenarios and situations where a model should be used or should not be used? And so in particular, to say initially the model had these limitations, but we were able to do this work. We found more data, we collected more data, or we adjusted the model significantly, or we found a new approach, and then that led to a better model. So that kind of evolution of improvements to the results and to the overcoming limitations of the model is very useful for the end users to see that the model that they're looking at is the best possible under the circumstances, given the time that there was, or given the funding that there was, and the effort that there was, and so on. So really looking at, initially we've run into these problems, but we solve them in this way. I think that is a very important aspect of conveying assumptions and limitations. So include the ones that were lifted through the work that we've done. Explaining the shelf life of models. So if we train a model with certain data, and then now it's 3 years later, 5 years later, and the data is now, there's a lot more data available. The sensors have continued to collect data. There's a lot more patients that have, that we've collected data for. There's, more customers that have generated more data. So is it time to upgrade the model? Is the effort worth it? Can we get machines to do that for us? And so it's very important to do that. And working in scientific domains, you see that in science, the papers are published and they sit there. And 3 years later, there's a lot more data and no one updates the paper. And so it's kind of interesting to see that the scientific literature is frozen in time. Every single paper is frozen in time. It's a snapshot of what would be possible to do. So how can we document the shelf life of models, alert people when the predictions, the results are obsolete, when they could be significantly improved, and make our systems push in that direction. Explaining model calibration and training, I think this is very important. And I think that this is an area where the more that this is documented properly, the more there's possibilities for making sure that it's the best possible model available. The validation of the model, this is also another question. What data was used to validate it? What was the criteria that were used to validate the model? In a lot of cases for us, for example, we don't have a lot of observations about certain areas, certain geographical areas, about the water levels or other things. And so it's really hard to validate models in geosciences many times. Or imagine the water levels of the aquifers underground that may be hard to measure very precisely, or the composition of the rocks, etc. So validating models, we have to explain and justify what kind of approaches were used, if any, and that is very important to convey. Explaining uncertainty, when is it that the models are all pointing, using different models to point in the different direction is a very powerful explanation of why your models are recommending something that a user should believe and trust. Explaining the compatibility of model combinations. So we rarely use just one model. We usually combine several models. We may use a model of the soils. We may use a model of, weather predictions. We may use the hydrology model. So there are all of these different models. We bring in an agriculture model. There's a lot of things that make those models inconsistent or incompatible. And so you cannot present a user with results for the next few months that use models that are not compatible with each other, because then the picture that emerges is not a consistent picture. And so those are things that also we have to explain, and how we took those compatibilities into consideration. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, explaining this model evolution from the initial one to the final one, and what improvements we were able to do, and have the users that will help users understand the maturity or the quality of the final model, and the work that it takes to improve it. Thank you very much for listening, and I would like to thank also the collaborators that I've had over the years, which have been many, and also funding sources for this work. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.